Okay, Samira John, we are live on YouTube and have started recording. I think we can get going.
Welcome to everyone joining us online. This is our 10th and last session on the abolition of the death penalty, marking Human Rights Day today. The session focuses on nonviolence and forgiveness. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who has sponsored this webinar over the past 10 months. It was a Herculean effort. Amnesty International Canada, Carleton University's Youth and Justice Lab, the Human Rights Research and Education Centre at the University of Ottawa, the Canadian International Council, Saskatchewan branch, the Mardum Foundation, and the Payvand Society. Thank you to all of you. As noted, our theme for today is nonviolence and forgiveness. The abolition of the death penalty requires, among other things, a human capacity for forgiveness for the people who have suffered from the sanction in various ways. The trauma that capital punishment inflicts on individuals and society as a whole must be acknowledged, addressed, and in time healed in order to plant the seeds of nonviolence in diverse communities. Further, clemency plays an unquestionable role in the path towards the abolition of the death penalty. Today we have some wonderful panelists, which I have the honor of introducing. But before I do that, I want to remind people online that there is a Q&A. And also, one of our panelists, Bahar Sabah, has to leave at the top of the hour, so we will have a brief Q&A with her right after her talk. So please go ahead and flood the Q&A section with your questions. On the theme of forgiveness and nonviolence, I would like to tell the story of Goli Kuhkan. This is a young woman whose life reflects the intersecting injustices faced by many vulnerable women in Iran, especially those who are poor, from ethnic minorities, and victims of child marriage and domestic abuse. Goli is a 25-year-old Baluch woman from Gorgan in Golistan province. Her childhood ended almost before it began. At just 12 years old, she was forced into marriage with her cousin, a marriage defined by lack of consent, child motherhood, and systemic discrimination. By the age of 13, she had given birth to her son. For years, she endured severe physical and psychological abuse at home. In May of 2018, when she was only 18 years old, a violent incident changed the course of her life. Her husband was reportedly beating her and their 5-year-old son. Desperate, she called a cousin for help. When he arrived, a struggle broke out and her husband was killed. Both Goli and her cousin were arrested. Goli was illiterate, denied a lawyer, and coerced into signing a confession that became the basis of a death sentence under Iran's qisas, retribution in kind. Human rights groups quickly identified her case as emblematic of a broader pattern. Women who are victims of child marriage, domestic violence, poverty, and ethnic discrimination, later criminalized by a legal system that fails to protect them. After years on death row, on December 8, 2025, something finally changed. The victim's family formally pardoned her, a decision documented and signed before judicial authorities. Under Qisas law, this pardon canceled her execution. Before this, the family could have accepted quote unquote blood money, originally set at around $100,000, which was later reduced through fundraising to $65,000. But ultimately, the family chose forgiveness. This is undoubtedly a life-saving victory. Goli will not be executed. But the story's not over. Reports indicate that as a condition of her pardon, Goli must leave Gorgan, and she may lose contact with her son, who is being raised by his paternal grandparents. Moreover, although spared death, she is still expected to serve a reduced prison sentence, often ranging from 3 to 10 years in cases like hers. Her case drew international attention, including from UN human rights experts such as Special Rapporteur Mai Sato, who called for her execution to be halted. They highlighted the failures that defined her case: child marriage, domestic violence, forced confession, lack of legal representation, ethnic discrimination, and the broader misuse of qisas against vulnerable women. According to Iran Human Rights, many women executed in recent years come from exactly these same backgrounds. The global outcry from activists, journalists, ordinary citizens helped mobilize the legal support, advocacy, and the fundraising efforts that contributed to the outcome we see today. But Goli's story represents more than one person's survival. It reminds us that systemic change is needed, change to protect girls from forced marriage, to provide women safety from domestic violence and intimate partner violence, to ensure fair trials, and to challenge the death penalty where it reinforces these cycles of discrimination. Today, Goli Kuhkan is alive, and that matters. But until the conditions that shaped her life are transformed, many others remain at risk. Her story calls on all of us to keep speaking, keep advocating, and keep pushing for justice. Our first speaker for today is Arzu Osanlu, a professor at the University of Washington's Department of Law, Societies, and Justice, and director of its Title VI Middle East Center. She holds adjunct appointments in the School of Law and departments of Anthropology, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Women's Studies, and the Comparative Religion program. She received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology at Stanford University. Prior to that, she was a practicing attorney, having received a JD at the American University Washington College of Law. She turned to the discipline of cultural and social anthropology in order to better promote and advocate for the humanity and dignity of people in other societies, societies which are simultaneously entrenched in domestic and international politics and law, historical relations, and are constantly changing. Arzu, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. I was invited to give some opening remarks, and that's really all I want to do today. And I'll just say I'm coming to you from my new university, Princeton University. I'm in the Department of Anthropology, where I'm also part of an initiative to start a human rights program here. So I'm very delighted to be a part of this program for all of those reasons as well. And Samira, thank you. The way you introduced the issue is actually how I came to it. I'm a legal anthropologist. My first project was on the politics around advocacy for women's rights in Iran. And that's what really took me to Iran back in the 90s, the late 90s. And while I was there studying family law, I became very interested in the criminal justice system when I was in Tehran, and all around me, I saw that there was this deep concern for a situation not unlike what Samira explained, where during the month of Ramadan, a group of young men, boys really, were smoking, and somebody came up to them, an older gentleman who was a member of the Basij, and told them to stop smoking. And a fight ensued, and one of the younger boys who was smoking accidentally killed the member of the Basij, pulled out a knife and struck him. And this was about this time of year, back in 1999. And everybody I talked to was deeply concerned with what was happening to this person who was believed to be under the age of 18 and had all the facts showed this was an accident. This was a street fight that had gone awry. And yet he was arrested, charged, tried, sentenced, found guilty, sentenced, and all the appeals had been exhausted, all within a period of 3 weeks. So already people were very concerned about the procedural issues in the case, and Amnesty had gotten involved. Amnesty Germany had issued an urgent action appeal to save this young man's life, who was destined to be executed a day after the end of Ramadan, because they don't execute during the month of Ramadan. But it is the month of contemplation, and a lot of people got involved in a kind of advocacy around trying to convince the family of the victim to forego retributive sanctioning. And this is what struck me, because as Samira mentioned, I was trained as a lawyer in the United States, and I actually took a course on criminal sanctioning where we covered the death penalty in the United States. And one of the things that came up was the influence that victims' families can have in the sentencing process. Because from very long time ago, these were considered torts, private harms, the most extreme private harm being a murder. But at some point, legal anthropologists have noted that the point at which a primitive legal system is switched off and a modern legal system begins is when we have the death penalty not implemented or decided upon by injured parties who have emotion and a hunger for revenge, and instead the state takes over. Now, the Iranian situation is different precisely because it is treating murder continues to treat it as a private harm, where the family of the victim not only is involved in the sentence, but also decides whether the state should implement it or not. So I became very interested in this because I wanted to know. What I learned in law school was these people are very emotional. All they want is revenge. They should never have it. This is why the state steps in. So in a context where here we are living in, back then it was still the 20th century, why would victims' families forego retributive sanctioning when they had the right to ask the state to carry it out? So I was really interested in the fact that families of victims in Iran could ask for retributive sanctioning or forego it. Now, the way I learned about this quandary, this conundrum, was I was doing fieldwork in Iran, again, like I said, on women's rights. And I was at my friend's house and we were about to break fast, right? So there's the call to prayer. And preceding the call to prayer, Iranian television often airs scenes of mercy, of contemplation, of intellectual reflection. So we turned on the television to see, if the azan had started yet. And what I behold in my eyes, I'll never forget, which was the scene, which we thought was live because the sun was setting, of this young man at the scaffolding begging for his life. And there was a crowd of people, thousands of people, we later found out, outside, most people advocating against, but some advocating for, and some, of course, were just there as witnesses. And suddenly, and the camera panned to the crowd, a man's hand went up and he said, "I forgive him." And it turned out that it was the father of the victim, the Basiji. And for those of you who don't know, the Basij are a paramilitary force that the state has allowed to operate in its interests. And so this brings the value of the mercy into a political frame, in fact. Nevertheless, this was celebrated. And at the time, Iran's Islamic Human Rights Commission issued a statement about how they don't need the West's moralization and their human rights because they have Islam and Islam has mercy, and that's all they need. And so I became very interested in who would forego retributive sanctioning, under what conditions, and what does it really mean? And so then ensued a 15-year study on this topic. And I realized by studying this topic, I went back to Iran every year from anywhere between 4 months to a month to study this topic up until my book was published in 2020. It's called Forgiveness Work. And I realized that on the one hand, this giving the right of retribution into the family, but also having a moral or religious compulsion to be merciful and compassionate had generated or produced what I call a cottage industry, literally a cottage industry of civilian actors who are going around trying to pressure families of victims to forego retributive sanctioning. And so in my book, I look at the legal system, but then I also look at these civilian actors who range from obviously defense lawyers, and we have defense lawyers, or even judges. The new criminal procedures of 2015 actually create an affirmative duty on the part of all state officials, including magistrates and judges, to try to bring the parties to a settlement short of retributive sanctioning. And so this is one area which I thought was very interesting and peculiar in my own research, where private citizens and state actors, including judges, work together in many contexts to try to bring parties to a settlement, including having what we call jalese solvasazish, that is settlement and I guess, I don't know, settlement meetings outside of the court or in the court sometimes, or at families of victims' homes or perpetrators' homes, in all kinds of arenas. And so there are NGOs that have sprouted up that do this kind of what they call forgiveness work. And this is a term of art that my interlocutors use. I'm not bringing it out from myself. Korebakshish, they call it. And they do korebakshish. They go to all areas of the country. As is mentioned, there are artists involved, actual celebrities and stars, but also artists doing art productions. Many know about the cinema, but there's also theater. There's a new genre of theater called documentary theater, where I followed a troupe who put on a piece of theater, documentary theater, called Esosa Obiamag, the blue feeling of death, where the director actually and the writers collected true stories of people who had murdered and were on death row, waiting for families of victims to decide what to do. And they featured these individual stories through the speaking voices of actors, but they're true words. And in one case in particular, a woman by the name of Samira, actually, I believe it was, had just been released from prison, and she actually sat on stage alongside of the actress playing her role. But the whole point of this was to not just influence families of victims, but actually what my interlocutors told me, the social workers, the people putting on this play in the city, was to create a culture of forgiveness, to shift the taste of the society from one that seeks retribution and vengeance, because that's what the law allows, to also recognizing the right of forbearance, that forbearance too is a right that you can decide to carry out. Along the same lines, there are lots of pieces in newspapers and magazines, books and literature. And there was one particular op-ed that was very moving to me, which the author was herself a lawyer, and she stated, "Forgiveness is also a right." And this comes from this idea where families of victims feel that if they forego, and even if they take that compensation, it looks like they're taking money for the blood of their child, which is where that idea of blood money comes from. Although to me, it's just compensation in tort, just like we have personal injury in the United States. And I remember talking to a mother who had lost her son, and one of the social workers said to her, "Think about forgiveness." And the mother, far from what I thought or what the urban Tehranis thought, said, "Well, what would my neighbors think? What would my neighbors think if I didn't execute, right? If I forewent, that would somehow suggest that my son was in the wrong or something happened." And so there was a whole set of sort of like a web of beliefs and understandings that had to be addressed and undone with what my interlocutors called their forgiveness work, trying to change the culture on the ground. And so I wanted to offer this as my opening remarks as something that I think is remarkable happening in Iran. But I also think that a group that wants to think about abolishing the death penalty can think about how families of victims and other social actors can be involved in forms of nonviolent advocacy to change the culture on the ground from one where we have a taste for retribution, whether it's in the United States, which also has retributive sanctioning, even if it's not owned by the family of the victim, to one where we might consider having a more passionate justice system that takes into account many of the outstanding societal mitigating circumstances that bring about the societal harms that we're forced to endure. And I'll just say one last thing that my interlocutor said to me that Iranians will understand very well about why they do this kind of advocacy. And one of the actresses from the play said to me, "As mas ke bar mast," that which comes to us comes from us. So we should be cognizant of that and move to change society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arsunju. That was fascinating. I mean, one of the things that I always think about is the fact that this problemization we can do between this primitive versus modern legal system, and how Iran sort of almost puts the citizens in the driver's seat, which I always found really fascinating. And so hearing from you was really, really amazing on that. And I hope you'll stick around for the Q&A, because I do have some questions for you. I want to go to Bahar Saba, and just a reminder, please put your questions right away in the Q&A for Bahar, because we're going to do a short brief Q&A with her because she does have to leave. Bahar Saba is the senior researcher on Iran and Kuwait at Human Rights Watch. For over a decade, she has been carrying out investigation, documentation, and advocacy work in connection with the human rights situation in the Middle East and North Africa, with a primary focus on Iran. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Bahar worked at several international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Reprieve, and Article 19, where she investigated a wide range of human rights issues, such as the death penalty, arbitrary detentions, torture and ill treatment, unlawful use of force, discrimination on various grounds, and accountability, and authored numerous research reports and advocacy briefings. Bahar, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And I would like to also apologize to everyone in advance for the need to leave earlier today. And thank you for your flexibility and for accommodating this. So as we speak today on the Human Rights Day, several people have already been executed. This year, an average of 4 to 5 people have been executed on a daily basis. Over half of these executions have been for drug-related offenses, which should never carry the death penalty. And based on extensive documentations by human rights organizations and UN experts and bodies, executions are carried out following systematic and widespread gross violations of due process and fair trial rights. This gives rise to an appalling right to life crisis that underscores the need for sustained work and advocacy towards the abolition of the death penalty. The death penalty is the ultimate cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment, and that is why Human Rights Watch and many organizations across the world oppose it in all circumstances and for all crimes and call for its abolition. The theme of today, obviously, is the capacity for forgiveness and nonviolence. And I would like to start by making a broader remark that indeed the recognition for the humanity of the other and the recognition that the death penalty is cruel, inhuman, degrading, and inherently violent and irreversible is key in the global efforts to abolish the death penalty and change the cultures and attitudes towards the punishment. Beyond this broader point, I would like to focus more specifically on the issues pertaining to pardons in connection with death sentences that arise from murder cases, which have been discussed already. And I would like to focus on some of the points, Samira, you mentioned, on how in many of these death penalty cases, we see an interplay of various types of injustice, inequality, discrimination, how structural changes are needed to both ensure that the rights of families of victims of murder who've suffered unimaginable loss of a loved one to justice and effective remedy, while respecting the human rights and dignity of individuals also accused in murder cases. So I will focus on how the system stipulated under domestic laws in Iran effectively breaches international human rights law and how it's been used by the authorities of the Islamic Republic to deflect outcry, criticism, and to shift responsibility from themselves and evade it ultimately, and how the system also perpetuates some of the inequalities and injustices that we observe in many of the death penalty cases. As we know, and I'm sure many present are completely familiar with the broader context, the death penalty in Iran is imposed for a wide range of offenses. Some of these should not be criminalized at all. Some of these are vague national security offenses that breach the principle of legality and are routinely used to crush dissent. The death penalty is also used for offenses that do not meet the threshold of the most serious crimes, and that is limited only to intentional killing. And even then, the death penalty under international law can be used in very exceptional cases and with full adherence to the highest standards of fair trial rights. And one of these standards is the right to seek pardon and commutation of a death sentence from the state. So any deprivation of life, including through judicial executions that contravenes international law, is arbitrary and unlawful in nature. So under Iran's laws, the death penalty can be imposed under three categories of offenses. One is ta'zir or discretionary, such as drug-related offenses. One is hudud, where we have vaguely worded offenses such as enmity against God. And the qisas category, which when it comes to murder, allows for individuals to seek the death penalty. So in murder cases, the power to pardon rests with the family of the murder victim. It is the family who can choose to forgive the individual convicted or to accept the payment of blood money or diya. So the first issue here that we face is that this system contravenes international law because sentences in such cases are not open to pardon or amnesty by state officials, which, as I mentioned, is a requirement under international law. In their reactions to and their responses to the UN experts and bodies, Iran's authorities persistently refer to the right of the family to pardon in murder cases to shift the responsibility that is squarely theirs to private citizens and to ultimately evade it. So in just one example that I will refer to in a response to the UN experts in connection with a child offender on death row, in November 2024, Iran's authorities said, and I quote, "The duty of the government in this part is only to investigate and verify the intentionality of the murder, and the execution of the sentence can only be done based on the request of the guardians," unquote. So this is an example of how the authorities attempt to deflect criticism, and I must emphasize that the use of the death penalty against children is absolutely prohibited under international law. And so here we are seeing multiple layers of breaches of international law. The second issue is that this system effectively gives rise to circumstances that violate the absolute prohibition of torture and other ill treatment under international law. Every year we see reports that families of murder victims who decide to pardon the convicted individual at the very last minute, sometimes when the noose is actually around their necks and they're about to be executed. And this violates the absolute prohibition of torture and other ill treatment. Iran's authorities point to these examples as positive examples, but dismissing the severe psychological impact that they can have on individuals sentenced to death, which could include child offenders. There are also documented cases of such examples in public where an execution has been scheduled to take place in public. And again, public executions in themselves are degrading and incompatible with human dignity. The third issue that was mentioned at the beginning of this session is the various forms of injustice that are, and discrimination and inequality that are in the play. This system could effectively perpetuate some of the structural forms of injustice and inequality and discrimination that in many cases may have actually resulted or at least contributed to individuals committing an offense. Importantly, the economic situation of an individual on death row plays a really important role and can virtually become an issue of life and death in these cases. Individuals from impoverished and marginalized backgrounds who are unable to raise the amount of blood money that may be requested are at greater risk of executions. So authorities set an indicative amount for the blood money based on various factors. However, the family could decide to set a lower or higher levels. And in fact, every year there are reports of individuals who've been executed simply because they have not been able to afford the amount of the blood money that's been requested. And finally, I want to also speak about the broader context of the criminal justice system in Iran. So first, trials in Iran, including those that result in death sentences, systematically violate fair trial and due process rights in a gross manner. These violations are not restricted to political cases, as some may assume, and take place actually in the cases of individuals accused of ordinary offenses, such as murder cases that are not necessarily politically motivated. So, for example, there are well-documented patterns of torture and ill treatment committed in Agahi or police stations, in many cases with the aim of coercing individuals to make confessions, which are then routinely relied on in order to issue sentences, including death sentences, denial of access to a lawyer, summary proceedings, denial of access to case file material, and the evidence the prosecution is going to rely on. And this list really goes on. So by the end of the criminal proceedings, often many individuals would have been victims of serious violations of fair trial. Again, as I mentioned, the law allows for the use of the death penalty against children in violation of the absolute prohibition against it under international law. This impact is also, the impact of this system is also not gender neutral. So as again was mentioned at the beginning of this session, over the years, women have been convicted for murder committed in the context of domestic violence. And they've been executed. Some were child brides, married as early as 10 or 12 and surviving many years of domestic violence. Iran's laws do not have an absolute minimum age of marriage, and girls under the age of 13 could still enter marriage contracts with permission of a court and their fathers. There are no laws criminalizing domestic violence, and marital rape is actually permitted under the law. So many individuals who are on death row, including for murder, may have faced compounded levels of discrimination and inequality to their intersecting identities, including their economic status, their ethnicity, their gender. The death penalty globally, and in particular in Iran, continues to impact the most marginalized in a disproportionate manner. So I will end my intervention by highlighting that the family of murder victims endure unimaginable pain of losing a loved one to violence, sometimes in aggravated circumstances. And it is the state's obligation to ensure that they have access to justice and effective remedy. Not doing so in itself would be a violation of the right to life. And this indeed underscores the need to ensure that all criminal proceedings, from the moment of arrest to investigations and trials, strictly adhere to the highest standards of due process. Victim-centered approaches that take into account the impact of crimes on victims do not need to violate international law or perpetuate deep-rooted forms of inequality. There are many ways in which criminal justice systems, from the manner in which investigations are carried out to the sentencing guidelines, could adopt victim-centered approaches that are respectful to the human dignity of all persons involved. Iran's authorities have been moving against the global trend that has been going towards the abolition of the death penalty, and not only have not taken steps to restrict it, but have in fact over the years adopted more legislation, expanding the scope. So by retaining the death penalty and using it in a manner that blatantly violates international law, they continue to violate the right to life on a very large scale. And the authorities should be held into account for these serious gross violations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahar John. We don't have any open questions right now in the Q&A, but I wanted to ask you two quick questions before you go. You mentioned that for Iran right now, it's 45 people are being executed on a daily basis, and half of them are for drug-related offenses. What can be done to, press upon Iran that executing people for drug-related offenses is cruel and inhumane punishment? Has there been any momentum on Iran's part to at least, take a look at this, to consider not doing this for drug-related offenses?
Mm-hmm. So it is an average of 4 to 5 this year, which, as Amnesty International, I believe about a couple of months ago, published, would mean that the number of executions this year would reach a record that has been unseen since the late 80s. So it really shows the true nature and the scale of this crisis. Drug-related offenses, again, because they do not meet that threshold, they should never carry the death penalty. So these are serious and very clear violations of international law. There has been, and many of you may have seen, in fact, that there has been a momentum by individuals on death row themselves, by families of individuals on death row, speaking up about the death penalty, going on strike, and demanding the international community to pay attention to their situation. And I must emphasize that many of these individuals are in an extremely vulnerable situation, in a sense that they're sitting on death row without any protections, that their sentences could be implemented at any moment. Therefore, it is incredibly important to keep the spotlight on this crisis, on the broader crisis of the executions, but also the drug-related death penalty cases, and ensure that they receive attention. Human Rights Watch, other organizations have repeatedly asked for the international community to use all opportunities to press the authorities to abolish the death penalty, but in the meantime, establish an immediate moratorium.
Last question for you. I'm just wondering, and maybe let me know if this is outside your purview, but what sort of impact does Iran's internal politics have on the question of the abolition of the death penalty in the country? Does it have any impact?
So one of the issues that we have been recording, and many other human rights organizations have been recording, is that the authorities have increasingly used the death penalty in recent years as a tool of political repression. So the death penalty, as I said, is inherently cruel, inhuman, but also it's been used as a tool to instill fear in the population. And we have very vividly seen this in particular in periods following protests where individuals have taken to the streets demanding their rights, asking for change, that the authorities have on a larger scale even used the death penalty on politically motivated offenses. Or we have seen since the June conflict that the use of the death penalty has increased again, with individuals being sentenced and convicted and executed on politically motivated offenses on a larger scale. And therefore, we can see that in addition to all these fair trial related violations, we see issues related to discrimination. The death penalty is also has been used and is being used at the moment as a tool to instill fear. You're on mute.
I was just thanking you for joining us today and taking some questions before you have to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our next speaker for today is Roya Burumand, co-founder and executive director of the Abdurrahman Burumand Center for Human Rights in Iran, a historian with a PhD in the history of international relations and contemporary Iran. She previously worked with the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, where she focused on discrimination and violence against women in North Africa. Since 2001, Dr. Burumand has led the Burumand Center's research and advocacy on Iran's human rights record and transnational repression, authoring and editing reports and newsletters on terrorism, crimes against humanity, extrajudicial executions, and Iran's abuse of the death penalty. Ms. Burumand, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here and dedicating December 10 to discuss the death penalty in Iran and a path towards the abolition of the death penalty. I was told to talk about what we do as well. And so I think in order to complement what Bahar said, I would take you more to the history of the judicial system, of the justice system in the Islamic Republic and the judiciary. And perhaps, you know, we need a more structural look at the problem of the death penalty that involves murder, crimes, and other crimes that do not involve the families but are as deadly and as harmful to hundreds of thousands of Iranians and migrants. As Bahar said, the number of executions have been a record high in 30 years. And we have over 1,794 people executed today, or at least, you know, reported as executed this year, and 112 in December. There are over 200 acts carrying the death penalty in Iran. And so the theme of this seminar speaks directly to the mission of the Abdurrahman Burumand Center. My sister and I founded the center to promote a culture of human rights and democracy, which we felt was lacking among the elite and the general population in 1979, and to help lay the ground for a peaceful transition in Iran, one that establishes the rule of law and ends the cycle of violence. For us, that work begins with confronting and understanding the past and the present, making patterns of violations visible, and inviting victims and the wider society to reflect on human rights, the rule of law, and democracy through a shared commitment to truth-telling, with the hope that they will make the right decisions about their destiny when they have the opportunity to do so. Our main tool for this is OMI, the Memorial in Defense of Human Rights, a unique searchable database that documents the lives and deaths of people killed by state violence, regardless of their gender, religion, ethnicity, nationality, political belief, or the crime as they are alleged to have committed. OMID is both a historical record and a platform. It gives families and survivors a space to tell the truth about what happened, to restore the dignity and the memory of their loved ones, and to learn about the rights that were violated, as well as learn about the harm done to others than themselves. We believe that the prerequisite of building a more just future and a non-violent judicial system is to understand what went wrong and why. When we began this work in 2001, we assumed that we were, I can go over the details of what we have documented since we started in 2001 and respond to questions. But what I can say is that in the over 27,000 cases that we have published, about 3,340 are people charged with murder, and 6,135 executions are drug related. So, which means that murder cases are not really dominant in the execution landscape of Iran. When we began this work in 2001, we assumed that we were building an archive of a terrible past and prepare for a future transition. We didn't anticipate that we would have to document new waves of violence, mass executions year after year, mass killings of protesters, politically motivated assassinations, and transnational repression. So we had to turn our attention to current executions, a far more difficult task in the face of secrecy and fear of retaliation, while also strategizing for advocacy and campaigning to create pressure on Iran's leaders and judiciary, including in murder cases. Sometimes with success, often with no success, but sometimes with success. The use and abuse of the death penalty in Iran, as Bahar said, aims at terrorizing the population, spread fear rather than preventing crime. Iran's drug policy is a very good example of this because, thousands of executions have taken place and still, addictions or drug use is prevalent and trafficking is continuing. Iranian authorities have shrouded executions in their systemic violation of the minimum standard of due process in secrecy and resisted scrutiny. They have punished and silenced those who have reported about their abuses and have protested the imposition of archaic laws, such as the 1981 Qisas Bill, which codified the eye for an eye principle in criminal law. They have imprisoned those who called for legal reform and respect for due process of law, or advocated against the death penalty. They have shielded themselves behind religious and cultural arguments to defend their heavy reliance on executions to maintain order, quote unquote, and ensure conformity with official values. However, the introduction of Sharia into criminal law was not the result of tradition or popular demand. Iran's first criminal code, adopted in the 1920s, was secular and sanctioned by the most prestigious Ayatollah of the time. There is no unanimity among Muslims, and many majority Muslim countries have stopped using capital punishment altogether. In this context, I do not believe that forgiveness, as currently structured in Iranian law, is a realistic path to abolition or to a peaceful transition. First, you have to consider the sheer scale and nature of the harm. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost relatives to state violence and to an arbitrary and corrupt judicial system. The harm is not only personal, it is institutional and structural. For 45 years, the law itself has undermined the rule of law. The justice system born of the revolution was and remains vengeful, brutal, and contemptuous of due process. Its purpose is not to rehabilitate or restore, but to punish and terrorize. On February 15, 1979, a revolutionary Islamic tribunal held its first session in Tehran. Its goal was to punish those deemed enemies of the revolution and to spread fear. The first Sharia judge and head of revolutionary tribunals, Hujjatul Islam Sadegh Khalkhali, was appointed directly by Ayatollah Khomeini and was told to issue Sharia-based rulings, quote unquote. For months, there were no procedures. Jurisdiction was whatever the religious judge said it was. For example, in one case in Shiraz, where a man had been pardoned but not released by the Revolutionary Guards, Ayatollah Khalkhali, who was, an itinerant judge at the time, arrives in this locality and decide that this man had to be executed as soon as possible. The file of the man arrived after his execution. So basically, there was an execution based on the statements of the Revolutionary Guards. After February 1979, courts did away with lawyers and appeals. Hundreds of lawyers, including many who opposed the Islamization of the criminal law, were barred from practicing. The Bar Association was shut down for years. Judges, God's representative on earth, were granted extraordinary powers, including the authority to convict based on their own knowledge in the absence of convincing evidence, which, we have documented repeatedly. This happens where the judge, whether it's in drug cases or even murder cases, the judge convicts based on his own knowledge and not on solid evidence. In April 2nd, 1979, in a televised address, Khomeini responded to critics of these tribunals by saying, "There should be no objections to the trial of these people because they are criminals, and it is known that they are criminals. All this about a lawyer being needed and that their pleas should be listened to, these are not people charged with crimes. They are criminals." A month later, Khalkhali explained that the revolutionary courts were born out of the anger of the Iranian people, and these people will not accept any principles outside of Islamic principles. There is no room in revolutionary courts for defense lawyers because they keep quoting laws to play for time. This tries the patience of the people, quote, end of quote. In such system, crimes could be defined retroactively. Revolutionary courts across the country tried thousands without clear charges, without evidence, without counsel, and without the possibility of appeal. Those sentenced to death were often executed shortly after conviction. In the first 5 years of the Islamic Republic, from February 11, 1979 to February 10, 1984, we have so far documented at least 7,379 executions. 45 years later, these revolutionary courts continue to operate without due process, relying heavily on coerced confessions. Despite some legal reforms, the judiciary that exists today, populated by thousands of seminary graduates and judges selected primarily for their loyalty to the revolution, is built on this legacy. Interrogations in criminal cases continue to take place without the presence of lawyers, opening the door to systemic abuse. We too often see convictions, mostly, if not only, based on self-incriminating confessions. People are hanged after summary proceedings where defendants and their lawyers are not given a chance to speak, which is the case in many drug-related trials. Children have been sentenced to qisas after being tortured or manipulated into self-incriminating confessions by interrogators. One of the most consequential changes after the revolution was the formal integration of qisas or lex talionis into statutory law. This was strongly contested. A group of 110 legal experts wrote an open letter to the parliament protesting the retribution bill, arguing that it had serious legal, moral, religious, and practical flaws. They warned that if enacted as drafted, the law would harm Iranian society and damage the perception of Islamic justice. And I'm quoting, drawing on the Quran, they argued that murder is not just a private dispute between the perpetrators and the victim's family, it is a social harm. Society itself is injured and must be a party to prevention and punishment. Penal policy should serve collective interest, not privatized revenge. They also reminded lawmakers that throughout the history of Islamic jurisprudence, attention to public interest has been central, and that Islam does not reject scientific methods or modern knowledge in the management of social affairs. Despite these warnings, qisas was codified, while many of the signatories were purged from the legal profession. Since then, thousands have been sentenced to death for murder, premeditated or not, intentional or accidental. The state has pushed the burden of deciding their fate onto the victims' families. Authorities present this as a religious obligation, as if the state itself has no responsibility. This law has privatized justice and institutionalized revenge, forced families into impossible choices, undermined the rule of law. The value of life is effectively priced through blood money, which is not equal for men and women. Outcomes depend on victims' families' resources, pressure, and social position, not on equal application of the law. Many families do not want to kill, but they also cannot genuinely forgive in the absence of some measures of accountability. They are subjected to immense emotional, social, and sometimes financial pressure. When punishment is negotiated between private and often unequal parties, instead of determined by clear right-based norms, there can be no equality before the law. People guilty of the same crime can be hanged or go free. This is not conducive to reconciliation. Questions have remained unanswered 45 years after the revolution. Can lex talionis, a principle that predates Islam and appears in multiple cultures and religion, really be treated as divine, immutable, and beyond debate? And even if it were religiously valid, can it be reconciled with modern commitments to human dignity, equality, and the prohibition of cruel and inhuman punishment? So, where does this leave us with forgiveness? Millions of people have been harmed by the post-revolutionary justice system. This is a reality that we cannot underestimate. Forgiveness is necessary, but cannot be a substitute for structural and legal reforms that guarantee the independence of the judiciary and respect for due process. A culture of nonviolence and forgiveness can emerge only when the right to life is protected by law and practice. Punishment is no longer privatized and subject to bargaining. Victims are offered truth, recognition, and meaningful forms of reparations. And society as a whole confronts the injustices of state violence, including the death penalty, and acknowledges the harm done to victims. Our work at Omid shows that many families do long for something beyond revenge. They want the truth to be known. They want their loved ones' lives to count for something. Many want to prevent others from suffering what they have suffered. We see this on a regular basis when we interview people. But for forgiveness to be healing and to support abolition, it must be voluntary and grounded in a system that itself renounces arbitrary killings. Until then, our responsibility is to document, to speak, and to insist that the right to life and the rule of law be at the center of any discussion about Iran's future. I will stop here and will be happy to respond to any question you may have. Sorry about my voice.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ms. Burumand. We will come to the Q&A after Omid speaks. I just want to point out a couple of things that I found really interesting, that you said that the murder cases are not the dominant reason why we're seeing executions in Iran. And I want to come back to that, and also the political repression and what you have been documenting at Omid. Speaking of Omid Milani is our last speaker of the day, scholar of human rights law and a multimedia artist whose work explores interdisciplinary and transformative approaches to contemporary human rights discourse. His research spans law and aesthetics, domestic and state-sponsored violence, constitutional rights and freedoms, political philosophy, and socio-legal studies of human rights. His current projects focus on critiquing hierarchy and examining both the origins and manifestations of state force. Omid, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Samira, for the introduction, and many thanks to our organizers and sponsors of this webinar series. For the past year or so, they've made invaluable efforts to make this webinar series possible. And also thanks to our attendees who have come to this session from around the world. I would like to share some reflections on the questions of nonviolence and forgiveness, and also share some elements of complexity. And I don't intend to provide a conclusive analysis of these two subjects. In fact, I would like to share a few, as I said, elements of complexity for further reflection. And when I'm thinking of nonviolence, I also thought that it would be fruitless and also futile to end these webinar sessions without speaking of nonviolence and forgiveness. One of the reasons thereof is that one of the languages that the state speaks very well is the language of violence. And it is a language that is also spoken by several illegitimate hierarchies for maintaining, perpetuating, and also for establishing any hierarchy. Violence is used and abused. The use of force is commonplace in the formation of different sociopolitical systems at the point of origination, at the point of the birth of a political system, be it through a revolution, war, and otherwise, and also for maintaining the system in place. The use of force and violence is also commonplace among different systems. Grotesque examples of such abuses of power and use of force is in countries like Islamic Republic of Iran, where the hierarchy has been established in a quite illegitimate fashion for maintaining power and control, the use of force. And in the example of the death penalty, we can say the application of the death penalty is primarily done so for the purpose of maintaining power. So applying nonviolence as a strategy is quite effective in the sense that it changes the game that this state has designed for itself, for its origination in the first place, and also for maintaining itself and its own hierarchical structures. And it is a language that the state can't speak and is not fluent in that language. So it is quite powerful to think of how nonviolence can transcend the hierarchical structures that are abusing power and apply force and lethal force for maintaining themselves. And one of the many fruits of nonviolence, I would say, is forgiveness. And when I'm thinking of forgiveness, it appears to me that forgiveness is in many ways an exceptional expression, is an exceptional human expression. And that reminds me of our first session where we discussed the exceptional nature of the death penalty and sovereign's exceptional expressions. But in this case, forgiveness, as Jacques Derrida puts it in his essay on forgiveness, happens to be outside of the domain, the juridical political domain. And in that sense, it goes beyond law and politics. And it is also a sovereign act that redraws the lines, redefines categories, and it goes beyond judgment and categories that are produced by the system and also are abused by the system to justify the use of force. So in that sense, we can see some traces of a shift in worldview, whether when we apply nonviolence as our political language, or whether we apply forgiveness as an exceptional human expression. We see some shifts in orientation in our worldviews, how we view the issue, the question of violence in general. And I have to also mention that forgiveness can take place in also the political realm. This is something that involves institutions and third parties, but it also takes place, as I said, outside of the juridical political domain. And that is a quite dialogical instance of forgiveness. There is no third party involved in that. But this distinction has been made in an essay by Jacques Derrida as well. The absolute forgiveness that takes place at a dialogical level, where the perpetrator and the victim stand face to face, and the victim forgives the perpetrator, is quite different than the type of forgiveness that involves an institution. So in the former sense, in that dialogical sense, forgiveness appears to be a human and not abstract notion. It's just kind of nonsensical to forgive the state. It is impossible to forgive an abstract entity, a pattern of conduct. But it is quite possible to think of forgiving an individual. And that's where I would argue that forgiveness and aesthetics, for forgiveness and creativity are linked. Through forgiveness, as I said, the individual entertains the possibility of redrawing lines and redefining categories. And in that sense, forgiveness is a quite creative process. And it has so much to do with ethos rather than pathos. It has so much to do with our character, our worldview, the way and how we position ourselves in the universe, rather than suffering and the pain that is inflicted on all of us through different manifestations of violence. So in the Aristotelian modes of persuasion, we know that the death penalty and the discourse on the death penalty is quite pathos-laden. There is so much suffering, inordinate degrees of suffering and pain is involved. But to move towards forgiveness, we need to entertain ethics and ethos rather than pathos. So this is a shift, as I said, in our approach, our orientation. And this may or may not happen for individuals. I don't think that forgiveness can ever be prescribed. And this is a process that may be experienced by some individuals, and it may not be experienced by others. And I know that in many religious contexts, forgiveness is discussed. The most frequent verse in Quran is referring to forgiveness, but I think there is no need to view forgiveness through the prism of the religion. And it is another aesthetic point that I think is quite relevant to the discussion. And that is how we see the dark and the light, how we see the evil and the good, and how do we define them? Do we see them as absolute darkness on the one hand and absolute light on the other, or we see them as rather spectra that involves different nuances and different complexities. I would argue that our human experience, our human characters, is far from being categorically defined. And I think it is quite important to remember that part of the process of forgiveness involves the truth-telling, and storytelling can help us in that regard. And in that regard, you may be able to find traces of humanity, something that you recognize in the perpetrator that would allow you to move towards forgiveness. And I think it is quite pertinent, it's quite relevant here to mention Jafar Panahi's most recent movie, It Was Just an Accident, that depicts the story of a torturer who is found by the inmate who was tortured by him, and it goes on this human, complex, nuanced interaction between the perpetrator and the victim, and how it is exquisitely shown that it is what we experience is quite far from black and white, oversimplified categories. So I think in one of the chapters of Arzu's book, the initial phrase or statement is one by Ludwig Wittgenstein that says, aesthetics and ethics are one. And I think this is where we can see how aesthetics can help us towards moving towards forgiveness, and creation of a new self can come out of the act of forgiveness. So it takes courage, it takes power. And as Hannah Arendt and others have also mentioned, it has so much to do with the miracle of life, with natality. It is as if you contrive a new self. And in that sense, as I said, it is quite exceptional. It can never be prescribed. And nonetheless, it is quite vital for any healthy society to kind of entertain the possibility of annihilating binaries, to go beyond the dogmatic binary worldviews that are often portrayed by abusive political regimes to justify the use of violence. I think I've shared a few elements of complexity, and I look forward to the Q&A to delve deeper into what we've discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omid. It's really interesting listening to all of our talkers today, because everyone focuses on a different portion of this. It seems like Ms. Buruman sort of grounds us in the structural reality and the impediments of the legal system in Iran, whereas Omid, you're talking about the evolution of the self, and Arzu was talking about how at times the system that Iran currently does have can put citizens in the driving seat in terms of forgiveness. I wanted to come back to something that Roya brought up in relation to forgiveness, and that's truth telling. And that you said some of the people that you've interviewed talk about truth being the most important thing for them, and having their truth talked about. Can you speak a little bit more about this, the relationship between forgiveness and truth telling?
Yes, thank you. This is really a key question, because for those of us, and I would put myself also in the category of victims, for us, society acknowledging the harm is the most important, because the state wants...
Sorry to interrupt you, but there are people in here who may not know what the Iranian government did to your father. Could you just briefly tell us what happened to him? Thank you.
Well, my father was a pro-democracy lawyer and opposition to the Shah when he was in Iran. And he was assassinated in 1991. He and hundreds of others outside Iran have been assassinated. So this repression has gone beyond Iran's border to silence and intimidate a lot of people, including my father. But we had no justice. His death was a piece of news in the French media, and then that was it. And so year after year, we tried to keep his memory alive. But the fact that society moves on is very difficult. And I think another example that was really moving for me was a survivor of the 1988 prison massacre. We commissioned a report to a legal expert, to a famous expert, and the report got visibility. And we organized a seminar in Oxford to talk about the path to accountability or justice for victims. And this seminar was long, and a lot of people had come there and all day long. And then one of the people who was there had told a friend of his from university that he was a survivor of that massacre. And these people were all traumatized. And, we have a society that is traumatized because the scope of violence is so wide. But these people in these prisons were in a space of a very few months or very few weeks, thousands of people were hanged in secret. Their level of trauma has nothing to do with ours, right? Like, because they were carrying the burden of a truth that no one wanted to hear about and no one wanted to talk about, and many people didn't know about. This subject was taboo, and it's only when these reports started to come out and the testimonies coming out that the media started to cover, and the discussion, and the state tried to justify itself for having done it. But he had said that after leaving, that during that day he was his head was hurting and he felt dizzy, and but when he drove to his home 2 hours away from Oxford, he cried all the way long. And then that night he slept without the dead haunting him in his dreams. So I think this is very typical of what this man probably doesn't need a trial, doesn't need anyone to be killed or anyone to be even imprisoned. The fact that society after 25 years finally acknowledged and that there were experts and international experts thinking about what happened was enough for him. And now I don't say that everyone is like him, but I think that and that's in part why we do what we do, is that the acknowledgement of society, of people you don't know being interested in the harm that was done to you, it's a big step towards a peaceful resolution of this trauma. It's not enough, but it's a very important piece. Did I miss your question?
No, that was perfect. Omid, can you pick up on this idea of acknowledgement of harm and how far that goes in society, and even on a personal level for a person's recovery?
I think it's quite vital to let truth shine through narratives, through personal narratives. And I think in the absence of that, we cannot have any dialogue in society. And to hear what has happened, to acknowledge that, although it would be quite painful for the narrators, for the ones who tell those stories, is quite necessary. Because it is only in the presence of sharing those horizons, those dialogical horizons, that we can engage in some sort of dialogue, some sort of debate on whether and what about what happened and who did it and why that event took place. And in light of those instances of truth, we can find those human elements where we can sow the seeds of forgiveness. And I think that would come naturally when we realize that the absolute dark and absolute light do not exist. We create that human capacity, that kind of room for ourselves to shift our perspective. And it's quite difficult, but as Ms. Brumand mentioned, it's quite vital to share truth and tell the truth. Truth commissions around the world, in South Africa, in Canada, elsewhere, are part of such efforts to let those stories be heard. And I think it's quite necessary. And without that, forgiveness is impossible.
I just want to pick up
Maybe
on
I would just
go ahead.
add a point is that
Sure.
the truth is important in the healing process. The fact that society acknowledges what happened, but the truth is also crucial to understand what went wrong and what needs to be done so that this doesn't happen again. So the truth also play a very important role in the non-repetition and in prevention. So it's not only a matter of healing for the victims, it's also for society to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
I want to ask you, both of you, though, is it enough?
The
Is
truth,
it enough? Is the truth enough?
the truth is not enough. The truth is not enough. It depends what you do with the truth. So, I really don't believe that, the hundred of thousands or millions of people who have been harmed expect every perpetrator to go to prison or, and I have to say, some of the protesters, for example, who we have, it's going to be a very difficult transition if we ever have this transition because, protesters who have been harmed or have lost an eye, some of them really want to blind the people who hurt them. And this is because, in 1978, it wouldn't cross anyone's mind to want to blind a police officer that had lost that person to lose an eye, right? So, the culture that the Islamic Republic has brought to the society is harmful in that way. But I think, the insistence on the fact that people make mistakes and that harming, the eye for an eye is not going to bring closure. The fact that someone else dies or the fact that someone else lose an eye is not going to make you recover your sight, and it's not going to make you not miss your loved one. And so I think, we as civil society and political actors have a role to play in this, so that this dialogue starts before we even have a chance to see if truth is enough or not,
And if I may add, I don't think that the truth is enough. I think truth is not a destination, but truth, on the other hand, the process of engaging in dialogue, sharing perspectives, that fusion of horizons, I think that is something that is far from a destination. As I said, it's a process and it involves different practical outcomes. And I think in that sense, truth for me, or truths are enough. But I agree with Ms. Brumand that only the truth on its own, it cannot heal any wound. And I think truth in time can alleviate our traumas, and they can show us the way not to harm ourselves and others in the future. But as I said, it is not a destination to arrive at.
Iran's structure is that of a totalitarian theocracy. We know that the state repression is brutal. I'm just wondering, I want to come back to what Ms. Buruman said about the culture, and just pick up on Omid's evolution of the self and how forgiveness can never be prescribed, as Omid said. In what way do you think the people of Iran have far exceeded their rulers or evolved in that way? Because there have been a number of studies done that has said that Iranians, if they could, would not vote for an Islamic Republic. Quite the opposite. And all of that, the things that go with that. In what way do you think the culture has changed beyond what the government has tried to implement?
Who starts? The older person in the room. I think, we have to take a step back and say that I think the culture of the leaders of the Islamic Republic and that segment of the Iranian population was not shared by many Iranians. So, this culture was imposed on them, but it was not necessarily adopted. I think, the violence we saw after the revolution, the mass killings or the extrajudicial killings, and I mean, everything was happening outside the law. We could have seen a lot of this happen at the level of the population. We could have seen lynchings, a lot of lynching, a lot of, killings in, privately, but we didn't have that. And so I think this was an imposed or for example, take the polygamy, right? The polygamy, could be really prevalent, but it's not really prevalent, right? Because the society didn't adopt it. And not that individuals did, but society as a whole never accepted it. So, but at the same time, the fact that justice is a private and that it's a decision of the victim, the punishment is a decision of the victim, that will be hard to overcome, because I think that has in some ways settled in at least, for people who were practicing Muslims, or, for people who are not exposed to any dialogue and discussion and debate about these issues. I think I even had, students who fled after 2010, and, some of them, well, but qisas is a decision of the victim's family, and they didn't even question it, right? So I think this is going to be a problem. But overall, I want to think that, as we saw in the protest, there was some violence in response to the extreme violence against protesters, but mostly, people attacked buildings and cars, and, they could have done more, right? I mean, so I think mostly I'm hoping that society is ready to move on from being scared and to live in fear. Or maybe I'm too optimistic, but
Hope is all we have.
yes.
Omid, do you want to pick up on that?
I don't think I have anything more to share on this one.
Okay, I have a question here in the open session here. It says, this is from David Headland. Over history, terrible things serve as a springboard for future regimes that might be even worse. This is evidenced in Iran. Generation by generation, how does this spiral end? What would that look like in Iran? Do you want to take that on, Omid? How do you end this cycle of violence?
Yes, to put an end to this vicious cycle of violence, we must be courageous enough to see that the perpetrator and victim are both victims of violence. So the perpetrator, the one who commits an act of violence, is themselves a victim of violence in the first place. And to acknowledge that, I don't think that's easy, but to acknowledge that that a human is worth more than being a brutal, violent individual is task that would take so much in terms of emotions, in terms of courage and power, but that would put an end to that vicious cycle of violence. And that, as I said, this is where artistic expressions, aesthetics can help us see the vestiges of humanity, even in those individuals who have perpetrated most heinous crimes. It might sound out of the box, but I think we need to be courageous to step out of the box if the problems inside the box are insoluble.
I think, that the end of the cycle of violence comes with the understanding that people can change. But I also think that, as I said, society has to acknowledge what happened. It has to be public. It has to be memorialized. It has to be in school books. It has to be, the same way the Holocaust was remembered. We need museums. We need, but at the same time, I think that some degree of accountability is inevitable. And some people who have had a leading role in mass violence have to be imprisoned. I mean, at least removed from society, removed from a chance to harm again. But most importantly, I think society will calm down if laws are changed. There are major structural changes in the judiciary, that you have a new system of a new justice system that is based on the rule of law, and that they feel comfortable that there is accountability and monitoring, meaning like that there is a national human rights body that, unlike the ones that we have now, that is more worried about human rights violations in the US than anywhere else, that there is a real human rights body, that there is a real, political pluralism. And I think that slowly, this acknowledgement, the fact that society is not forgetting, but is moving on and is remedying, and because remedying harm is compensation for victims. I mean, society has to compensate the victims. The children of someone who was executed for spying, 3 people were executed for spying in June 2025 for spying for Israel. These people had nothing to do with Israel, and they were in the past smuggling alcohol in the country, right? And the children, except for one who is 18, are all, under the age of 13. And these people, even the Imam Khomeini Emdad committee has told them, no, your father was a spy, we are not going to support you. So these people have to be compensated for, the wrong that has been done. And if that happens, and if the laws are changed, and if society keeps remembering and giving visibility to the past that should be behind us, I think, society will eventually move on. All societies have somehow moved on.
The necessity for some sort of reparation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
There's a question here. It says, we chanted never forget, never forgive quite a lot in the streets in Canada. Na faramush mikonim na. What is it? Na faramush mikonim na. I forget what it.
میبخشیم.
Na mibachshim. What shall we replace it with?
I've been thinking about that. But maybe Omid has a better response.
I'm not sure what terms we could use, but what I can say is that one of the desired byproducts or products of state-sponsored violence is what I call perpetual victimhood. So that sense that you have been victimized and you are powerless to transform your life, your worldview, your position is something that the state desires. So if it's your choice, if you want to forgive or you don't want to forgive. But if forgiveness happens, then you are empowered. You are healed in a sense. It is quite cathartic. It is going, as I said, beyond the categorical understanding of the world, and in that sense, it's quite empowering. And the states, abusive, authoritarian states in specific, they don't like individuals and citizens to be empowered. So I think forgiveness, once it comes naturally, is quite empowering. But as I said, it cannot be ever prescribed.
There's a very specific question for Ms. Burumand. The question is, what do you do with the list of death penalty victims documented through the Omid Memorial Project? How do you believe it can impact efforts to abolish the death penalty in Iran?
Well, I think in the long term, seeing the harm that is done and innocent being killed, wrongful killings, and the lives of people who were, who had studied or who had, families and normal lives, and suddenly they're not there anymore. I think that, I think people like to, like you're in the supermarket cashier line, and then you have these magazines, people, and basically providing you junk gossip, and people look at this, right? So other people's lives are interesting for people, and this is what we also use to get more people to look at the stories in Omid. But so in that sense, I think it does give some perspective to people about what it means to kill, right? What it means to have the death penalty. But in the shorter term, I think we are using these lists, for example, to push for a drug law reform. That's what we did. I mean, no one had our statistics, how many people have been killed for, holding a little bit of drugs, right? So we use this to push the Europeans to not fund the Iranian anti-narcotic police. And that led to a reform that made the number of drug offenders executions drop significantly. But at the same time, there was resistance inside Iran because they need to kill. And the drug offenders are the least politically costly killings, right? Because no one really cares about who they are. And, I'm glad that Bahar mentioned the fact that they are now, because of all the campaigns about the fact that, drug offenders should not be executed at all, and these are not part of the most violent crimes. And the families pay attention thanks to social media, and they are fighting a little bit for themselves. But it is very useful to be able to say, look, if this is for stopping trafficking and addiction, then why the numbers are not coming down? Why do you keep, I mean, every year, tens of thousands of people are taken off the streets and forcefully rehabilitated, right? So, it can help the argument that instead of punishing, you have to figure out the source of, addiction, for example, and the root causes. So this is one reason. And then, due process violations, when you say that this person had committed a crime against the state, or had killed people, or was a terrorist, and then you look at when we can get the information and we can get knowledgeable people and family to tell us, then you see that this person was kept 6 months incommunicado and had all his teeth broken, and all, had lost great amount of weight and had signs of torture on his body. And then the whole confession based ruling falls apart, right? Because then, what is the value of this confession? And so, it has multiple, and sometimes we have helped people not be executed. There were a couple of kids who were sentenced with due process violations, and unfairly accused of murder and sentenced to death, and there was no forgiveness for them. And so, when you look at the other kids killed and how they have been tried and prosecuted and executed, then you have a stronger argument to say that this has happened with this person too, right? And you should put pressure on Iran's leaders to review these sentences. So sometimes it happens. It's not as often as any of us would want, but it's not impossible.
There's another very specific question for you, Ms. Burumand. It's about intergenerational dialogue. The question is, I would appreciate hearing some of her thoughts on the role of intergenerational dialogue and experience sharing in paving the way for truth and reconciliation. And before we started, you were speaking about the next generation of Iranian human rights defenders, and the need to see more people doing this work. What impact do you think intergenerational dialogue can have?
Well, I think dialogue is always important. I think that the new generations resent the older generations for their mistakes. And so that makes, and generally, the Gen Z don't take any of us seriously. So, the value of what we say is what it is. But generally speaking, I think it's important to share these experiences. It's also important to tell them that we were angry for many years, and then we tried to do something. And we are much less angry because we don't feel helpless, because this anger comes from the helplessness of doing something or changing something or having justice or whatever it is. The state makes you feel helpless and alone. This is what they do, that no one cares, that you're alone and no one cares about what happened to you. And doing something is making you feel a lot less helpless, which then makes you, move on and also have positive, act positively, whether it's for you or for people around you. But this dialogue is necessary, and it happens. It doesn't always happen in the best circumstances, but it's inevitable because we read each other, right? Social media, and so even though, they may resent the mistakes of the previous generations, and I have to say that I was in front of the Iranian embassy in March 1979 in Paris, asking people what they are voting for. Why are they voting for something they have no idea about, right? So I don't necessarily feel too guilty, even though I did think that Khomeini is going to go to Qom, and maybe it's not as big of a deal. But so I will be guilty all my life. But this happens. It's just that it has to be maybe encouraged by people between the Gen Z and us, like, people like you, people who have access to both, have dialogues with both, and figure out how we can share this experience and transmit the experience and help them also with their own traumas.
Thank you so much. Omi, do you want to pick up on the intergenerational dialogue? I mean, you're younger than both of us.
I think we have failed to acknowledge the difference in the worldview of the youth in many perspectives, and that's why they don't listen to us. And we have tried to sell them the old school, outmoded versions of truth, and they are intelligent enough not to accept those narratives. So I can see that there is so much room for creativity in terms of how we engage with them. And this is something that is not often addressed. And we always think of the youth and children as people who are inferior to adults and older generations. This needs to be abandoned to begin a dialogue. And it is no easy task. I'm always inspired by specifically children. And I think in terms of forgiveness, there's so much that we can learn from children. And that kind of acknowledgement of their worldviews, specifically in the context of Iran, I can say that the youth are no longer viewing the world in a religious manner. So they can see the world in a different way, but they might not be able to articulate the whereabouts of their Weltanschauung, their worldview. This is upon us to engage in dialogue with them, to see the world through their eyes, and also in order to be able to share what we see. So, and I think this has been not addressed, and we are not doing a great job in terms of communicating our thoughts, ideas to the youth, and they are, as a result, feeling abandoned or excluded. So they are not engaging as much as we expect them to.
I may, I think we really can't generalize, because there are some of us who have better connections to the younger people. It's just, we even tried cartoons to give visibility to due process violations. We tried different ways of accessing them. The problem is also that, I mean, we have no religion or nothing to impose on them. I mean, anyone trying to impose religion on me will have a hard time. But I think they are generations that have been told what's right and what's wrong. And maybe the mistake that many of us do is to continue to tell them what's right and what's wrong. And they do not want to hear that. At the same time, I have had dialogues with some of them who say, we don't want to be told what to do at all. And that will create anarchy in any state if no one wants to be told what to do and no one wants to follow any rules. But we are not there yet. And I think that we all have to make more efforts to understand each other and speak languages that are more that can reach out to the other.
I think this is a great point. At this point in the last sort of 10 minutes, if either of you would like to give just a quick last thought on nonviolence and forgiveness in a future Iran and what that might look like. Or how we get there.
How we get there.
Nice big broad question before we finish.
Yeah, that's a $2 million question. How we get there, I think that we need political actors to play this game. I think political actors are very distant from the human rights community, generally speaking, and they don't see what we do as relevant, but I think the experience of what went wrong and how you can fix it, because there is expertise. There is expertise in transitions. There is expertise in what are the institutional changes that would be necessary to prevent repetition. And then, you need cultural programs, you need, as I said, memorializations, you need justice to a certain degree, and you need very strong institutional reforms so that there is checks and balances in the country to prevent leaders from becoming violent. And so some of the actors probably do not want that, but I think that's the salvation, is to figure out what needs to change for us not to have a repetition. And I think nonviolence will come after generations. I think once people are trusting the state, because that's what happens, is that in countries like Iran or any totalitarian or authoritarian state, the trust between the population and the state has disappeared. And to have a nonviolent society, you need society to trust the state. And so the first priority is to ensure that this trust is reestablished.
Omid?
Yes, I think
Give us Omid.
yes, I think our power lies in our creative agency. And I think with that flame of creativity, we can transform discourses, environments that are hostile, violent, and so forth. And I think we need to acknowledge truths that have been denied, including the fact that human individuals, are sovereigns. So we need to stop selling, as I said, outmoded versions of truth, over-politicized, compromised narratives, because they are no longer selling. And if we don't address that truth crisis right now, the population that is not heard, that is not included, will be recruited by others who would find means to do so, and they would mobilize them for their own purposes. So acknowledging truth and the role that it plays, acknowledging our power and our creative agency, I think the future is bright once we cherish and we hold these close to our hearts.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank both of you for everything you've contributed today. It was really wonderful to hear both of you in conversation with one another, and to our other two panelists who unfortunately had to go. Again, happy Human Rights Day to all of you. I hope that we continue to not allow people to relinquish human rights, although the past couple of years has taken a real attack. And let's hold steady to it.
Let's keep hope.
Yes.
All together we will prevail.
Thank you so much to everyone joining us online and to everyone else who joined us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.